Hello and welcome. My name is Jeffrey Pitzenbarger, and today we will be discussing 19th through 20th century diplomatic relations and the rise of the MPR. My primary reader is Dr. Dellinger, and my secondary reader is Dr. Sweeto. The thesis for my paper is as follows. Through the examination of treaties and agreements involving Mongolia made by other countries, the political landscape that formed the Mongolian People's Republic, or MPR, was a result of the unfavorable diplomatic relations towards Mongolia by the Soviet Union, Russia, and China, and how these treaties attempted to keep Mongolia as a part of China. China believed that Mongolia was a part of China and refused to concede Mongolia's independence. Today, we will be discussing some of the treaties discussed within my senior thesis. And before we get to those treaties, however, we will have a brief overview of the historiography of this topic. Before the launch of the Cold War between 1900 and 1945, historians were apt to focus on the diplomatic relationships between European and Asian countries. Historians such as E.T. Williams, who authored The Relations Between China, Russia, and Mongolia, wrote in 1916 utilizing diplomatic tactics to understand the relationship between Inner and Outer Mongolia. He also explores the tax rates in Mongolia prior to the formation of the Mongolian People's Republic in 1924, and he also writes on how China and Russia use the divide between Outer Mongolia and Inner Mongolia to control Mongolia. Within E.T. Williams' works, he relies heavily on government sources and documentation, such as treaties and agreements between these countries, to explore the relationship that formed thereafter. During the Cold War and beyond, between 1946 and today, historians have shifted in focus on the sources that they utilized to sources from government documentation to sources written by the Soviet Union about Mongolia. However, during this period, historians were also overly critical of the work done by the Soviet Union because of the political landscape that formed as a result of the Cold War. Historians shifted to using industrialization and economics to understand the relationship between Mongolia and the Soviet Union. They also used sources straight out of the Soviet Union written by Russia about Mongolians. However, they were usually an example of a historian would be Henry Bradshaw, who wrote The Sovietization of Mongolia in 1972, focusing on growth of infrastructure and economics such as agriculture. Bradshaw helps illustrate what life was like in Mongolia in the 1960s and how the Mongolian People's Republic had grown over the years into a stable, independent government. Now we will be discussing a few of the key treaties explored within my senior thesis. These treaties are the Treaty of 1881, the Agreement of 1912, the Agreement of 1913, and the Tripartite Agreement of 1915. The Treaty of 1881 allowed Russia to begin trading with Mongolia and allowed Russian merchants to trade in Mongolia free of duty. This treaty was made between Russia and China and allowed Russian merchants to trade within 50 versts or 33.1 miles on either side of the frontier. The frontier in this case for Russia would be the northern part of Mongolia, and the Chinese frontier would be the southern half of Mongolia. Russian consulates could also begin building homes in China or Mongolia, giving Mongolians a first-hand glimpse of Russian architecture, which were far more advanced than the tent cities that they were accustomed to. The Agreement of 1912. This agreement between Russia and Mongolia came after Mongolia claimed independence from China in 1911 during the Chinese Revolution of 1911. In this agreement, Russia partially recognizes Mongolia's independence and recognized Dezhban Damba Kuhutuka as the ruler of Mongolia. This agreement allowed Russia to play both ends of the field. They partially recognize Mongolian independence, likely because they understand China would eventually come looking to know why Russia had done this. By wording the agreement carefully, Russia would not get into diplomatic problems with China, but could still exert their influence over Mongolia. The Agreement of 1913 was between China and Russia. They met in 1913 to outline the autonomy of Outer Mongolia, without including Mongolian representatives. Russia recognized that Outer Mongolia was under the suzerainty of China during this meeting. China also recognized Mongolian autonomy and promised not to send troops into Mongolia. However, this agreement angered the Mongolian government and delegates because they were not invited to take part in this agreement, in an agreement that was over their own country. The Tripartite Agreement of 1915. The Tripartite Agreement is exactly the same agreement as the Agreement of 1913, it just involved Mongolian delegates. However, at this conference, the Mongolians continued to attempt to fight for their independence, citing that in 1912, Russia had recognized Mongolian independence through that agreement. However, the Russian delegates in attendance completely outright denied this. This put the Mongolian delegates in a position where they had no choice but to sign the agreement recognizing China's suzerainty over Mongolia. Next, we will be discussing the travels of Maho Tien. After the establishment of the Mongolian People's Republic in 1924, a Chinese merchant and traveler went to explore Mongolia from 1926 to 1927. This traveler was named Maho Tien, and the book he wrote was Chinese Agent in Mongolia. Maho Tien describes the taxes implemented on Chinese merchants in Mongolia, and he also explores the new Mongolian education system under the MPR. He discusses the fact that merchants were responsible for paying fees lest they be fined by one of the 3 tax offices in Mongolia. In order to trade in Mongolia, a Chinese merchant had to have a special permit that allowed them to do so, and if they were caught trading without this permit, they would be arrested and fined. The MPR made it illegal to drive livestock south and enforced fees on Chinese merchants to maintain their theaters. Then, if the Chinese merchants who did not attend the plays, and the plays often depicted China's oppression of Mongolia, they were fined an additional $60. These fees and fines of the Chinese merchant class really are a prime example of how Mongolia and the Mongolian government was attempting to push China completely out of their country. He also explores the use of propaganda, and he explores the education system as well. Maho Tien describes a propaganda poster that essentially depicts Russia as the protectorates of Mongolia from China, Japan, the US, whoever might have interest within the area. He also explores the education system and some of the books that they would use to teach the children, such as the Mongolian Youth Magazine. Some of the educational books that he saw, some of the textbooks he saw, were loaded with communist ideology, such as Lenin and the Youth, Japanese Imperialism, Duties of the Revolutionary Youth League, and some of these books even go on as far as to explore what life in the universe is like. He also explores how Mongolians shed Chinese habits, such as he also such as the switching from opium to smoking cigarettes. So in conclusion, the change in historiography came during the Cold War when historians shifted from the use of diplomatic documentation such as treaties and agreements toward industrialization, economics, and agriculture. The formation of the MPR was a direct result of treaties and agreements between Mongolia, China, and the Soviet Union. Mongolia only ever wanted to be independent from China, and the unfair treaties between them, China, and Russia regarding the autonomy of Mongolia led to the formation of the Mongolian People's Republic, a government independent of China.